The story begins where the road ends, where the trees rise like blackened ribs against a colorless sky, and where the wind carries voices that don't belong to the living. Vancroft Hollow had always been a place folks avoided after sundown, but in the summer of 1898 the woods seemed to hold their breath entirely. That was the year Lydia and Mara Vancroft returned, the two pale, silent daughters of a man everyone in the Ozarks remembered for reasons they wished they didn't. Their family homestead squatted deep in the valley, warped and sinking, as if the earth itself wanted to bury it. No lamp glowed inside, yet neighbors swore they saw shadows moving across the windows at night, long before the sisters arrived. Some claimed the house never truly went empty after their father died. Others insisted they heard him still, his voice carried on the wind, low and gravelly, muttering commands no one could quite understand. Lydia and Mara arrived at dusk, stepping from the fog like figures pulled from an old nightmare, their faces pale, their eyes sharper than memory. They had been gone for years, vanishing without explanation just weeks after their father's burial, a burial that had required the coffin to be nailed shut from the outside. No one asked them where they had gone. No one dared. But every person in the township sensed something had come back with them, something that moved in the spaces between their footfalls. At night, lamps flickered in distant homes as strange lights quivered in the trees beyond Vancroft Hollow. Some nights the lights looked human, like lanterns carried by unseen hands. Other nights they drifted like fire, bending and twisting in ways no flame should. And always, beneath the wind and the rustle of leaves, came the same faint, impossible sound, two women whispering, and a man answering. The townsfolk prayed it was only the woods playing tricks. But the woods around Vancroft Hollow had never been kind, and they had never been silent. Not since the day the girls were born. Not since the day their father began his strange teachings. Not since the day the first voice was heard in the dark. And now, the voices had returned. Only this time, they were not whispering. They were calling. The return of Lydia and Mara Vancroft to Vancroft Hollow was not marked by trumpets or announcements, only by the quiet dread that settled over the valley when the sisters' silhouettes appeared on the ridge at sundown. Their absence had stretched for years, long enough for the townsfolk to convince themselves they had escaped the curse of their bloodline or perished somewhere far from the Ozark pines. Yet there they were, grown, severe, wrapped in dark traveling clothes that looked too heavy for the humid Missouri summer, their faces pale against the dying light. No one saw the wagon that brought them, no driver, no mule, no sound of wheels on gravel. They seemed to materialize from the tree lean, stepping onto the old trail with an eerie calm, as though the forest itself had carried them back. People watching from a distance whispered that the sisters moved with a stillness that was unnatural, their posture too rigid, their gazes too steady, as if something inside them had been hollowed out and replaced with something colder. The road leading to their homestead had been abandoned since their father's death, overgrown with briars and choked by vines that curled like strangling hands around old fence posts. Yet the sisters walked it with familiar ease, never stumbling, never hesitating, as if guided by a memory far stronger than time. Those who dared sneak closer noticed that neither sister spoke a word. Lydia, the elder, walked slightly ahead, her eyes fixed on the collapsing cabin in the valley below. Mara followed a step behind, clutching a worn satchel to her chest as though guarding something fragile, or dangerous. The silence between them was suffocating, a silence shaped not by grief or shock but by something far older, something learned. By the time they reached the clearing, the air had changed. It felt denser, heavier, thick enough that the few watchers hidden behind trees said they could almost taste metal on their tongues. The Vancroft house stood exactly as they had left it, warped roofline, windows stained with mildew, porch sagging like a mouth missing its teeth. But those who looked closely swore they saw a faint glow behind the boards as if a lantern were burning deep inside despite no one living there for years. When Lydia stepped onto the porch, the boards didn't creak, though they should have snapped beneath her weight. Mara lingered at the foot of the steps, staring into the woods, her expression unreadable in the deepening dusk. And in that moment, the valley felt painfully aware that the sisters had not returned as the frightened girls who once fled, but as women carrying something unseen beside them, something that walked in their shadows and breathed softly behind their shoulders. Whispers about the Vancroft family had never fully died in the Ozarks, only settled like dust in the corners of old minds, waiting for the right moment to stir again. The sisters' return was all it took for those hushed memories to break free, carried from porch to porch, traded in low voices behind half-closed doors. Folks remembered the patriarch, Elias Vancroft, a man whose presence alone could still curdle the bravest man's nerves. Tall, gaunt, and watchful, He had ruled his remote household with an authority that made even outsiders feel unwelcome on his land. He spoke little to neighbors, yet everyone felt the weight of his stare, a stare that suggested he was measuring not their worth but their usefulness. People had long believed he held strange ideas about family, about purity, about the binding of blood. Not the kind discussed in church or whispered in polite conversation, but darker notions that made even superstitious men feel uneasy. Long before his death, rumors had drifted through town like smoke from a fire no one wanted to acknowledge. Some claimed Elias kept his daughters too close, that he raised them under strict, suffocating rules meant to isolate them from the world beyond the hollow. Others insisted they saw the girls walking in the woods with him at odd hours, heading toward places where the ground was scarred and the trees were carved with symbols. There had been talk of lessons that didn't resemble schooling, late-night chanting no one could explain, and a strange ritual that required the sisters to stand in silence before their father while he spoke to the dark as though it were listening. When the girls were young adults, several travelers passing through the region reported hearing unsettling echoes from the Vancroft Valley, 3 voices murmuring in a language they couldn't identify, one deep and commanding, the others trembling. Even after Elias died, people hesitated to speak openly. They remembered the day of his burial, when the coffin was sealed faster than any funeral the town had seen. The carpenter tasked with building it refused to comment on why he hammered the nails with such haste, though his hands shook for hours afterward. The sisters themselves had left shortly after, slipping away before dawn without explanation. Some believed they fled the weight of their father's expectations, others thought they feared the same shadows he once courted. But the older folks, the ones who'd lived long enough to trust their instincts over logic, believed something else entirely, that Elias Vancroft's reach did not end with death, and that whatever dark influence he cast over his daughters had not loosened but grown deeper. So when Lydia and Mara returned, older but strangely unchanged, those whispers rose again, carrying the uneasy suspicion that they had not come back alone, and that the past they tried to escape had followed them through the trees, wearing their father's voice. The first sign that something was wrong in the hollow came not from the sisters themselves but from the woods that surrounded their land, the same woods that had always been thick with superstition. Locals began noticing flickers of orange deep among the pines, faint bursts of light that rose and fell like breathing. At first, folks assumed it was nothing more than travelers making camp or hunters drying kindling. But the more people watched, the more unsettling the pattern became. These fires weren't steady or warm, they wavered with an unnatural rhythm, appearing for only seconds before slipping into darkness as if someone, or something, had cupped the flames in their palm. And the strangest part was the silence. Fire anywhere in the Ozarks usually came with a crackle, a snap, the hiss of sap boiling in the wood. But these lights made no sound at all, glowing and dying like silent warnings. Night after night the flickers grew bolder, brighter, drifting through the trees in places no sensible person would light a fire. The ground there was too damp, the underbrush too thick, the paths too treacherous for wandering at night. A few brave men ventured close enough to glimpse what they believed were lanterns swaying between the trunks, but when they called out, the lights slipped away with unnatural speed, snuffed out the moment someone tried to follow. Some said the lights moved like they were carried by hands, others swore they hovered, bobbing a few feet above the forest floor. It reminded old-timers of the strange nights during Elias Vancroft's lifetime, when the woods glowed faintly as if lit by torches in the distance, though no one ever admitted seeing the man himself outside at those hours. As the night stretched on, the fires became accompanied by something worse, muffled voices drifting through the trees. Low and indistinct, they never rose to a shout, never formed recognizable words. They sounded like rituals murmured in half-formed syllables, like arguments spoken through clenched teeth, like conversations between people who no longer remembered how to speak clearly. A few listeners, chilled to the bone, reported something even more disturbing, 2 quiet feminine voices and one deeper voice weaving through the dark, always in the same pattern, always circling the same part of the forest near the Vancroft homestead. No one wanted to admit what they feared, that the voices mirrored the Vancroft household as it once was, the voices of father and daughters locked in strange, secretive dialogues the town had pretended not to hear years ago. Now, with the sisters back, those murmurs felt less like echoes and more like rehearsals, as though the woods were learning their cadence again, preparing for the return of something that had never truly left. The discovery of the journal began with nothing more than a hunter following the trail of a wounded buck through the dense undergrowth north of Vancroft Hollow. The man had no intention of lingering near the Vancroft land, most folks avoided it out of instinct. But the woods were unusually quiet that morning, and his quarry had stumbled into a thicket he didn't recognize. While pushing through the brush, he noticed a patch of ground scorched to a brittle black, as if a fire had burned there recently despite no smell of ash lingering in the air. In the center of that charred circle lay several pages fluttering weakly in the breeze, edges curled and darkened. They looked as though they had been torn from a larger book and only half burned before someone, or something, decided to abandon them. Curiosity overcame caution. The hunter knelt and gathered the brittle sheets, surprised at how warm they felt, as though the fire had died only moments before he arrived. The handwriting covering them was cramped, slanted, and oddly aggressive, each stroke cutting deep into the yellowed paper. He recognized the name scrawled at the top of the first page, Elias Vancroft. That alone was enough to send a shiver down his spine. Elias had always been an unsettling figure, and the hunter had lived long enough to remember the man's stern face and the strange air that clung to him. Reading his words, even unfinished ones, felt like trespassing into a mind that should have stayed buried. The journal entries were fragmented, some sentences burned away entirely, others obscured by soot. But what remained was enough to unsettle even the most skeptical reader. Elias wrote of rituals he called bindings, of lessons he meant to pass on to his daughters, and of a force he believed dwelled within the forest itself. He described the woods as an obedient servant when addressed correctly, and hinted at something he called the blood circle, a ritual meant to merge the will of one person with another. His language shifted between cold instruction and fevered devotion, praising the strength of his bloodline and the necessity of keeping it unbroken. The hunter found repeated references to obedience and listening to the dark, phrases that felt less metaphorical and more like commands he believed the shadows around him would follow. The most disturbing lines appeared near the end of one page, where Elias wrote about the voices he heard at night, voices he claimed were growing clearer, guiding him, correcting him. He insisted the woods were speaking back to him, and that soon his daughters would hear them too. The hunter stopped reading after that, feeling the overwhelming sensation that someone was standing behind him, watching. He left the clearing as quickly as he could, but the unease followed him all the way home, carried on the knowledge that whatever Elias Vancroft had been trying to summon in those pages had not died with him, and that the sisters' return might be the final step in a ritual unfinished. The discovery of the half-burned journal began as nothing more than a hunter's search for shelter from an approaching storm. Jacob Trill had been tracking a wounded buck through the higher ridges when the sky darkened without warning, clouds swelling over the Ozarks with a speed that made him abandon the chase. He ducked beneath a cluster of boulders near the old Vancroft trails, a place most folks avoided out of habit, but the rain came down so hard he had little choice. As he crouched there, catching his breath, he noticed something strange lying in the wet leaves, a charred object half buried in mud, as if the earth itself had tried to swallow it. At first he thought it was a burned piece of clothing, but when he tugged it free, the object unfurled into brittle, blackened pages bound by a damaged leather spine. Even before he opened it, he felt a coldness radiating from it that had nothing to do with the storm. The pages were warped from past fire, edges curled and cracked, yet still legible in the center. The handwriting was unmistakably meticulous and rigid, the kind that belonged to a man who valued control and order. Jacob didn't know Elias Vancroft personally, but he had seen the man's script once before on a deed posted in town, and this looked disturbingly similar. The journal's entries were fragmented, but what remained sent a chill through him. There were references to rituals Elias called bindings, written in a tone that suggested not superstition but practiced certainty. He spoke of blood tethering blood, of preserving obedience through shared suffering, of keeping the voices in alignment. Some lines hinted at a belief that his daughters possessed something rare, something he intended to cultivate with unwavering discipline. Others alluded to lessons carried out in the woods, where he claimed the trees themselves listened and remembered. What unsettled Jacob most were the repeated mentions of a presence Elias referred to only as the head. In several entries, Elias wrote of preparing the ground for its arrival, describing a figure, or force, that guided his teachings and demanded absolute devotion. The burned portions made the context difficult to decipher, but the tone was unmistakable, reverent, fearful, obsessive. One surviving line described a ritual interrupted by something Elias called resistance, followed by a note about needing to quiet the girl's hesitation, a phrase that made Jacob's stomach turn. As he flipped through the final pages, he found frantic scrawlings that suggested Elias believed the presence had begun to speak through him, commanding him, shaping his intentions. Before Jacob could examine more, a crack of thunder startled him, and the wind surged through the rocks with a strange, almost human moan. For a moment he felt watched, as if the woods disapproved of him touching the journal. He stuffed the damaged book into his coat and fled down the ridge, but as he ran, he couldn't shake the sense that the pages he carried weren't simply old words, they were instructions that someone, or something, had been waiting for someone to read again. The discovery of the journal happened by accident, as most dark revelations in the Ozarks seem to. A hunter named Caleb Rourke was tracking a wounded buck through the thick underbrush near Vancroft Hollow, cursing under his breath as the trail led him farther from familiar paths. The woods were unusually quiet that morning, hushed in a way that made him feel watched, as though the trees themselves were waiting for him to take one step too far. When he reached a small clearing, he noticed something half buried beneath a fallen branch, its edges blackened and curled as if it had survived a fire. At first, he thought it was nothing more than a scrap of bark, but when he nudged it with his boot, the fragment split open to reveal lines of cramped handwriting. Kneeling down, he brushed away damp leaves and uncovered several pages singed along the sides, bound loosely with frayed twine. It was clear the pages had once been part of a larger book, something someone had tried, and failed, to burn completely. The writing was unmistakably human, yet uneven, with ink bleeding into the paper like the words were fighting to escape. Names appeared throughout the margins: Lydia, Mara, and most often, the signature of their father, Elias Vancroft. But it was the content that chilled Caleb. The notes spoke of rituals designed to bind blood to blood, instructions for ceremonies requiring absolute obedience, and references to something Elias called the hunger beneath the roots. He described hearing voices in the dark that demanded acknowledgement and claimed the forest had chosen his family to serve as intermediaries between the living and whatever waited beyond the veil of night. One passage mentioned a ritual room hidden within the Vancroft home, where the sisters were to be shaped into vessels, though no explanation was given for what they were meant to carry. Another page described acts meant to ensure loyalty, dominance, and silence, written in a tone that made Caleb's skin crawl with revulsion. What unsettled him most was the final entry, dated just days before Elias' death. The handwriting in that part was frantic, letters jagged and slanted, as if written by a trembling hand. Elias wrote that his daughters were starting to hear the voices on their own, and that something in the woods had begun speaking to them directly rather than through him. He mentioned an upcoming ritual meant to secure his authority over them forever, but the passage ended abruptly, the ink smeared as though the page had been yanked from the fire before it finished burning. Caleb stuffed the pages into his coat, intending to deliver them to the sheriff, but as he left the clearing, he couldn't shake the feeling that the forest knew he had taken something it wanted to keep hidden. The disappearances started quietly, small enough at first that no one tied them together. A traveling salesman failed to arrive in the next town, a fisherman's skiff was found drifting in circles with no one aboard, a pair of drifters who had camped near the old riverbank left their belongings neatly arranged but never returned for them. It wasn't unusual for strangers to vanish in the Ozarks, between steep ravines, unpredictable wildlife, and treacherous weather. The land itself could swallow a man whole. But after the third incident, people began to notice a pattern, one that chilled even the most level-headed locals. Every missing person had last been seen heading toward or passing close to the trail leading to the Vancroft property. That trail, once an ordinary dirt path, now seemed unnervingly quiet, as if sound itself refused to travel through it. Travelers who walked near it reported feeling watched, their footsteps echoing unnaturally, like someone was walking just behind them but disappearing whenever they turned. Some described a faint humming in the trees, the same rhythm as the strange fires reported earlier. Others mentioned hearing a woman's laughter carried on the wind, soft and breathy, yet impossible to ignore. A few even claimed they glimpsed two female figures standing motionless among the cedars, pale faces barely visible in the dusk. None dared approach, and those who tried found the path twisting unexpectedly, leading them deeper into the woods until they were forced to retreat. The sheriff organized a small search party, but their efforts yielded nothing except an abandoned pouch belonging to the salesman and an old shoe lying oddly clean on the forest floor, as if placed deliberately. The tracks surrounding it led nowhere, ending abruptly as though the person wearing it had stepped into thin air. More unsettling were the strange impressions found near the Vancroft homestead, indentations in the soil too large for any person yet too defined to be mistaken for an animal's. The deeper the searchers went, the more they sensed a growing heaviness in the air, a suffocating pressure that made each breath feel borrowed. Rumors spread quickly. Some believed the sisters were involved, that their return had awakened the same unnatural forces their father once courted. Others whispered the missing men were lured by voices, drawn by illusions, or claimed by something beneath the roots. The old folks, however, believed something darker, that the Vancroft sisters had resumed their father's rituals, and whatever they had summoned needed more than whispers and flickering lights. It needed bodies, and it had begun collecting them. Lydia and Mara Vancroft had always been regarded as peculiar, even before their disappearance, but after their return something about them felt fundamentally altered, as if the years away had carved new shapes into their souls. Their transformation revealed itself slowly, noticed first by hunters and loggers passing near the hollow during the early hours of dawn. These men reported seeing the sisters moving through the forest barefoot, unbothered by briars or cold soil, their long nightgowns trailing over the dew-damp ground. They walked side by side in complete silence, their heads slightly tilted as if listening to someone only they could hear. The eerie part wasn't their presence, it was the way the forest reacted around them, the wind falling still, the birds going quiet, the underbrush seeming to part ahead of their steps. People said the air around the sisters felt heavy, charged like the moments before a storm rolls in, and anyone who came close enough felt their skin prickle as though a faint electricum vibrated beneath the surface of the world. What frightened witnesses most was their eyes. Lydia and Mara had once been known for soft, timid gazes, but now their expressions were sharpened by an unnatural calm, their eyes glassy and reflective like still ponds. They didn't blink often, and they didn't startle when approached, behaving more like sleepwalkers than conscious women. One man swore that when he stepped into their path and called out their names, both sisters stopped simultaneously, turning toward him with identical motions, their faces devoid of recognition. Then Lydia murmured something in a low voice, a phrase he couldn't decipher, and Mara echoed it perfectly a heartbeat later. The men fled before discovering whether the words were meant as a greeting or a warning. Worse yet, their movements seemed to mimic their father's in eerie ways, as if pieces of him lived on in their gestures. The way Lydia tilted her head during moments of listening matched Elias Vancroft's old habit, the same habit that once made neighbors feel scrutinized down to the bone. Mara's posture mirrored his rigid stance, shoulders drawn back, chin raised slightly as though she were following some strict, invisible instruction. It was as though the sisters were not entirely themselves anymore, their personalities overshadowed by something pressed upon them, something inherited or imposed. Those who observed them began whispering that the sisters were reenacting old rituals, the ones their father had forced upon them years before. Some claimed they heard faint chanting when the women paused beneath the tallest pines, voices intertwining with a third, deeper murmur that shouldn't have been possible. Whatever had changed them was not simply age or trauma but a bond that clung to them like a shadow, reminding the hollow that Elias Vancroft's influence had not ended with his burial and that his presence, in some unexplainable way, might be walking beside his daughters still. The reports of a male voice echoing across the Vancroft property unsettled the townspeople more deeply than the flickering lights or shifting shadows, because it struck at the very heart of the fear they had buried for years. Elias Vancroft had been dead long enough for his grave to settle and for memory to soften, yet the voice described by those passing near the hollow was unmistakably like his, low, gravel-edged, commanding in a way that made even hardened lumbermen pause mid-stride. The first person to hear it was a trapper cutting through the western ridge at dusk. He claimed he heard a man speaking in a stern tone, as though reprimanding someone close by. When he approached, expecting to find a traveler or perhaps a trespasser, the voice abruptly stopped, replaced by the heavy silence that seemed to deepen with every step he took toward the Vancroft clearing. He swore he saw movement near the porch, a tall figure whose outline dissolved the moment he blinked. Within days, others came forward with similar accounts. A group of boys hunting raccoons at night reported hearing a man muttering in the direction of the old well behind the Vancroft house, though when they drew closer, the voice shifted to a whispering cadence, as if speaking through clenched teeth. A widow hanging laundry on her line at dawn claimed she heard the same voice drifting from the tree-line, low and rhythmic, like someone reciting instructions. What unsettled her most was the echo of a softer voice beside it, female, hesitant, almost pained. Rumors spread quickly, connecting these voices to the strange sightings of Lydia and Mara at odd hours, their faces pale in the moonlight, their movements stiff and deliberate as if responding to a presence just behind them. The town doctor, normally a rational man, confessed privately that he had heard the voice twice while riding past the old Vancroft path. The first time it sounded like a man pleading, his tone hollow and desperate. The second time it sounded like laughter, a hoarse, joyless sound that followed him long after he'd left the property behind. Some insisted the voice was nothing more than wind twisting through the broken cabin walls, others blamed owls or the natural acoustics of the valley. But those who had known Elias Vancroft intimately recognized something chillingly familiar, the cadence, the phrasing, the abrupt shifts between anger and calm. It was the way he spoke when giving instructions, the way he addressed his daughters when no one else was meant to hear. Every new account carried the same unnerving detail: whenever the voice appeared, the woods grew still, as though listening, and Lydia and Mara were nowhere to be found, as if their absence made room for something else to speak. The first time someone heard the voice was on a windless night when even the insects had gone silent, leaving the woods wrapped in a stillness so heavy it felt deliberate. Neighbors living along the ridge above Vancroft Hollow reported waking to a sound that didn't belong to the forest, a low, gravelly murmur drifting from the direction of the old homestead. At first they thought it was one of the sisters speaking, perhaps arguing, but the tone didn't match either woman. It carried a weight, a cold command that stirred an instinctive fear in anyone who listened long enough. The deeper voice rolled along the valley like a warning, steady and patient, echoing faintly against the hollowed trees as though the woods themselves were repeating it. Those who pressed an ear to their windows said it reminded them of Elias Vancroft, a memory they wished they had forgotten, a voice that once bent the will of anyone under his roof. Some convinced themselves it had to be a trespasser, or a hunter, or maybe a drifter sheltering near the abandoned house. But the cadence was unmistakable, something between a chant and a reprimand, filled with a chilling familiarity that made it impossible to dismiss. As the nights passed, the voice grew bolder. It no longer came sporadically but in repeated intervals, as though following a schedule only the sisters understood. Sometimes it emerged sharply, as if snapping out orders. Other times it softened into pleading tones, like someone begging to be heard or obeyed. More disturbing than the voice itself were the responses accompanying it, two softer murmurs, undeniably feminine, weaving through the dark in an eerie harmony. Their words were too faint to decipher, but the rhythm of the exchange felt rehearsed, a conversation revived after years of dormancy. Those who listened closely swore it mirrored the dynamic the Vancroft family had once displayed in life, the father speaking with cold authority, the daughters answering with trembling devotion. Except now Elias Vancroft was dead, buried, and supposedly gone from this world. A few brave souls walked toward the direction of the sound, lanterns raised, but the moment anyone stepped off the main path, the voice stopped as though it sensed an intruder. The silence that replaced it was even worse, a suffocating hush that pressed on the chest and made it hard to breathe. One man claimed he heard breathing behind him, slow and raspy, but found nothing when he turned his lantern toward the trees. Others reported the sensation of being watched, as though the source of the voice hovered just beyond sight, waiting for them to leave. And always, without fail, once they retreated back to their homes and barred their doors, the voice resumed, softer now, almost taunting, as if reminding the valley that death had never truly separated Elias Vancroft from his blood. The storm came without warning, rolling over the Ozark ridges like a living thing, and it was in its wake that the hidden chamber beneath the Vancroft cabin was finally revealed. Lightning struck one of the warped corner posts of the house, splintering the wood and sending a section of the wall crashing outward. Rain poured in, drumming on the floorboards, and as the wind whipped through the opening, it carried a chill that seemed to seep into the bones of anyone who dared approach. The collapse exposed an opening in the floor, just beyond the sagging kitchen boards, revealing a staircase that led down into darkness so thick it seemed to absorb the storm's noise entirely. Those who peered inside spoke of a smell that hit first, dust and rot, yes, but underneath it something sharper, like iron left to rust, something that smelled of old blood and the memory of fear. The chamber had clearly been used before, its secrets buried beneath layers of timber and dirt, and the storm had forced it into the open, demanding that the world acknowledge it. As lanterns were lowered into the opening, shapes emerged in the dim light that made even the most skeptical gasp. Wooden bindings were set in the walls and floor, worn smooth in places as though by hands that had never left them. A chair, heavy and strangely shaped, sat in the center of the chamber, reinforced with straps and chains, its surface polished in some sections from long, deliberate use. On shelves along the walls were objects whose purpose no one could identify at first glance, vials of powdered substances, carved symbols, and scraps of parchment inscribed with writing in a tight, unfamiliar hand. A faint, almost imperceptible hum seemed to rise from the walls, a vibration that made the hair on the back of the neck stand on end. Some swore the hum was like a voice, murmuring words that stopped just short of comprehension, while others claimed it was the storm itself, trapped beneath the floorboards. The deeper into the chamber they looked, the more they understood that this space had been constructed with a purpose beyond mere concealment. Every angle, every plank, every notch in the wall suggested preparation, a deliberate orchestration intended to control or contain something, or someone. The further back the staircase led, the narrower and colder the space became, until it seemed to compress the air itself, making it harder to breathe. The walls bore scratches and marks that hinted at struggle, though no one alive could remember the last time such conflicts had been witnessed here. And yet, the room exuded an almost magnetic pull, drawing attention to the chair at its center as though the house itself demanded a reckoning with the past, with the Vancroft family's secrets, and with whatever presence lingered in the darkness beneath the cabin's rotting floor. The last night at Vancroft Hollow arrived with a sense of inevitability, as though the forest itself had been holding its breath for weeks, waiting for the sisters to act. Lydia and Mara moved with a precision and purpose that unsettled anyone who glimpsed them from a distance, their bare feet silent against the damp earth, their dark eyes reflecting the pale light of the crescent moon. The storm that had opened the hidden chamber days before had passed, but it left the woods heavy with moisture and a metallic tang that clung to the nostrils, a scent that warned of something old and hungry. The air was thick and vibrating, carrying sounds that shouldn't have been audible, the rustle of leaves without wind, the snapping of twigs beneath invisible feet, a low, almost conversational hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The sisters carried objects from the cabin, relics of their father's dark teachings, into the clearing behind the house, arranging them in a pattern no outsider could understand but one that had meaning carved into every line, every shape, every whispered instruction from memory. As night deepened, the shadows themselves began to shift. Trees bent slightly toward the clearing, their branches twisting unnaturally as though straining to listen. The murmurs of their father, long dead, seemed to echo faintly through the air, merging with the storm's aftertaste, forming words just out of reach of comprehension. Lydia and Mara stood opposite one another, tracing invisible circles in the damp soil, their hands trembling not with fear but with a tension that felt almost alive. The wind rose in sudden gusts, carrying with it voices, some pleading, some commanding, some laughing in a way that made even seasoned locals shiver. It was then that the forest began to move as though it had a mind of its own, the shadows lengthening, wrapping around the sisters, pushing and pulling, urging them to finish what had begun decades before when the Vancroft patriarch had first taught them the rites of blood and silence. The ritual reached a fevered pitch as the sisters chanted in a language older than any spoken in the hollow, their voices weaving together in a pattern both compelling and terrifying. The ground beneath them quivered faintly, and those who dared watch from the edge of the woods claimed they could see shapes rising from the darkness, shapes that should not have been capable of movement. The air seemed to thicken, pressing against the chest, filling lungs with the scent of iron and decay. For a moment, it seemed the sisters had succeeded in summoning the head of the bloodline, the very essence of their father's influence. But the forest had its own ancient hunger, older than any human ambition or dark ritual. From the depths of the trees came something vast and unknowable, something that answered their call in a way they had not anticipated. The wind howled through the hollow, carrying the voices of the past, present, and something far older, and as the sisters' figures were swallowed by shadows, the entire valley seemed to acknowledge that the hollow itself had claimed the night, leaving only whispers of what had occurred to haunt anyone who remained to tell the tale.